Hey everyone, Professor V back again. This lecture is going to continue talking about Congress, but last time when we talked about Congress, we focused on the power of impeachment and conviction in the House and Senate. This video is going to expand on the rest of what Congress has the constitutional powers to do and covers anything that you might need to remember just at least as a review in terms of the makeup of Congress itself. So in that regard, remember that each state, as we talked about in the last video, has 2 senators, and that means that altogether, obviously, there are 100. Every state in the Senate then is equal in terms of power representation-wise. And then in the House of Representatives, it's based on population. So 435 people in the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years, and the Senate is every 6. I did want to focus on something first in this video that the Senate can do that the House does not get to do. And it's a unique, important task. And what that is voting yes or no on presidential nominees, whether or not they're going to become appointed to things like the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the Customs, ICE, head of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Secretary of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, head of Department of the Treasury, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Agriculture, Energy, Housing and Urban Development. I mean, it goes on. It's and those positions are generally called the cabinet, the president's cabinet, but with the exception of the Supreme Court. The reason is because, as we said in the last video, that Supreme Court members cannot be fired. They could be impeached and convicted the same way a president could. And we'll talk about that next video when we talk about Supreme Court more. But just a spoiler, that's also never happened. So it's never happened that a Supreme Court justice has been impeached in the House and then convicted in the Senate and removed. But if you're wondering, what that process is, how could a Supreme Court justice get off of the court? There are 3 ways: are they die, they retire, or they were impeached by the House and then convicted by the Senate. So with that, we go on to the Senate's. And now, if there's a tie, let's say the president at this point, Biden right now, or Trump before, or whomever it is in the future, if a nominee goes in front of the Senate can vote no, and then the president would have to put up a new person. And if it were a tie and it was 50-50, the vice president becomes the tiebreaker. They essentially become head of the Senate to do that task. So if it were 50-50, and you're fine if you're president because you know that your vice president's going to vote in favor of the nominee you chose, obviously. So it's not the 2/3 that's required for and for convictions. So that's why these appointments are easier to pass. With that said, they don't all pass, and there are times where, as I talked about in the last lecture, senators will vote down a certain nominee, and they should hopefully ask questions to the nominees about what their what their understanding of the Constitution is, what their expertise is, anything they think is pertinent to the job. But remember that the president, well, they can hire them with the help of the Senate. They can fire them without really anybody saying yes or no, other than them, with the exception of the Supreme Court. So I know that's a little bit of review, but just want to make sure everyone got that special role of the Senate. One other thing the Senate gets to do, and there are a few, but of especially importance also, is to ratify treaties. And so if, for example, when President Obama entered the United States into the Paris Climate Accord, there is a treaty, a worldwide treaty, that only 2 countries didn't originally sign on to: North Korea and Nicaragua. North Korea didn't sign on, perhaps somewhat predictably, in terms of they're not, the government of North Korea is not especially engaged in global affairs. Most scholars would consider the government to be more isolationist. So that may not be as unpredictable, but Nicaragua was an interesting exemption. And the reason for their government not being in the treaty was actually that they felt that the treaty should do more to curb global warming and climate change. So basically, every country other than North Korea agreed that there is something needs to be done, and Nicaragua agreed, but they wanted different wording in it. So pretty much the whole world signs on, and the U.S. was in that, but it wasn't ratified by the Senate. And ratification just essentially means it makes it permanent. If you want a word that I don't know if we've learned yet, it's to codify, and that's CODIFY. To codify something is to put it officially sort of into code, to legal code. So as soon as Trump became president, he took the U.S. out of that treaty, and back and forth we go. And we've talked about that pretty extensively with the president's powers. But just another quick important thing that the Senate can do that the House can't. Now, what can they both do? And there are some really big ones. And I don't know if you all knew this, but the United States, we probably did, is the wealthiest country in the world in terms of gross domestic product. And just to give you an idea of how big in terms of the economy the United States is, the United States economy is bigger than all of the European Union combined. It's a full almost 20% more than the Chinese economy. It's about 20 times the Russian economy. It's the United States has an enormous amount of wealth. And the reason I bring that up is because this, if you want to write this down, if you didn't already know, here we go. Congress controls all federal tax money. So I think we got the explanation pretty well last time with the Trump impeachment on Ukraine. But just a reminder, if you're blaming the president or praising the president for the economy, it's only partially correctly assigned, because the president, whoever it is, can't unilaterally spend money. They have to do it with the help, and Congress has to pass it at least a simple majority for the president to be able to have money to spend on the things that they want to spend for the country. So with that said, it's about a little bit over $5 trillion. You don't necessarily need to know all the numbers, but just to give you an idea, just the amount of federal tax dollars that Congress is collecting now and is in charge of, essentially, that through the IRS and other agencies, is over just the federal taxes are over twice what the entire Russian economy is. So it's an enormous amount of responsibility. And one thing we'll learn later in the semester is that the United States has chronic and growing debt, to the point where if I were to teach this in 2 weeks, the debt will be $2 billion greater, just about. It's growing at an enormous rate. I don't want to spoil the future lecture, but you guys can go on debtclock.org if you want and see the Treasury Department's running tally. We're well over $30 trillion in debt, the United States. Congress has to authorize that, and we'll get to that in future videos. But just so you know, the taxing and spending power of Congress, we call that, remember, the power of the purse, and that does include the power to borrow money. And we'll have to also talk about the Federal Reserve and how those things work. But with that said, let's move on to a power we've not talked about really at all yet, which is war. Congress gets to declare war. To me, this is one of the most important things about the checks and balances of the three branches of government. So again, it's even more so than the economy, I think, or at least as much. If you are upset about a war that the U.S. is engaged in, you have to also engage with Congress on that matter, as well as the president. In other words, if you're happy and you think a war was appropriate and good, not that you want people to die, but that you want this mission to be completed, the president might be praised for it, but Congress is the one who has to authorize it. And same if you are upset about a war and you don't like a war. And again, we're talking about for this direct involvement, not what's happening with the U.S. sending aid to Ukraine and aid to Israel. In this case, like a declaration of war. And it may not always be said that way. Technically, the last time war was declared was World War II, but that here's why that seems confusing. But there have been all kinds of wars, Professor V. There's been, Korea and Vietnam and Desert Storm in Iraq in the early 90s, and then Afghanistan, and then Iraq again. And those are still declared. It's just that the wording has, at least in those cases, gave the president a lot of latitude on, especially with Vietnam. And actually, that brings us to an important point right now. So Congress has the power to declare war. They might not always call it war, but it's the authorization for the use of military force. In fact, if you go look just online, you'll see that, people like President Biden and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, along with basically almost every Republican in the Senate, voted in favor of the Iraq War. But then later, when it became unpopular, there was this wiggle room that senators, now President Biden, said that he wasn't aware that what he was authorizing was basically was war. I don't know if that's that's the reason why these things are worded the way they are. I don't know how credible that is. I'll let you judge for yourself. But I will say this much, that if you declare war, you are giving the president not a blank check, but you're giving them the authority to then be the commander-in-chief in this war. And that means that they can move troops around. So if I had to ask you a pop quiz question right now, hopefully it would stump a few of you. If you had to guess which president, upon almost immediately within the first 6 months of becoming president, which president added 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan? And most people would guess maybe Bush. No, that's not right. It's really the next choice chronologically is Obama, and that is correct. The war is already, it may not be called a war against Afghanistan directly, because it's actually very complicated, right? The U.S. is trying to take out, at first, the Taliban, and then later, 20 years later, compromising with them and leaving in a manner that many would consider haphazard. But the war itself was authorized right after 9/11, and so it stretched along through many presidents, and it ended then with Biden's administration. And again, with that, Trump and Biden administrations both probably bear historical responsibility for the exit of Afghanistan. And I want to be objective, so I'd say, I don't think most of history would judge the exit very well. If you don't know about it, just briefly, there was a lot of chaos at the end, because as the U.S. was pulling out, the Taliban was taking over parts of the country that they had long held before, and the U.S. had promised to get all of its allies out. And there were a lot of people mad at Biden about it. And the reason I bring this up is to say, yes, the president has a significant amount of authority in how a war is conducted, but the Biden and Trump, for whatever you think about how they operated in war, Trump's initially being willing to even negotiate with the Taliban, which was a non-starter before, and then Biden's exit, those are only possible through congressional power. So yes, the presidents make perhaps mistakes, but the war being in Congress is a huge power. And I would argue just simply as this: I would much rather have much rather not have one person deciding whether to take our country to war. I'd much rather have 535 people debating it. And that's really simple logic behind it. Now, there is something called the War Powers Act, and Congress passed this. So if you're writing in your notes, Here's the next power of Congress. They can do something called override a veto. I know we've talked about this before, but just a reminder, a veto is when a president says no to a bill or law, a bill becoming a law. They decide that they won't sign it, and it's essentially dead at that point. So Congress comes up with a bill that says we want to do these things, spend money on this and that, power of the purse and the wallet, remember? And the president says no, he vetoes or she vetoes, whoever it is. That's usually the debt. That's it. But the Congress in this situation and in all situations has this choice. Can we vote again and get 2/3 vote to override the president's no on the veto to make it a yes anyway? In other words, how can a law become law without the president's signature, not taking the Supreme Court into this at all? The answer is Congress can override the veto and say yes anyway on top of the president's no. So you might say, well, wow, you're saying now that Congress is in charge of all the money in the federal government, basically. They're in charge of declaring war. This is a pretty powerful entity. It is. And, it's almost a good intellectual exercise as you study each branch. You could almost argue which branch for each of them is most powerful, but they all have really good arguments because each has their own specific power and a significant amount of it. But the goal was in the Constitution to spread it around so that it's diluted enough that if it's not fully concentrated in one branch or one person. So going back to the overriding veto, that's a very powerful thing. I mean, and that's what we're saying is Congress could just pass bills into law all day long, every day, without the president ever signing them. That's really powerful. It is. Here's the good news for the other branches that may not like that, or if you're wondering, well, why doesn't that happen all the time? It rarely happens. It's less than 5% of the time out of 100 bills. It's going to be less than 5. And here's why. It's ready for my corny joke again. It requires 2/3 of a vote, and 2/3 of the Senate won't agree on whether the grass is green or the sky is blue. They don't agree on any. So to get that 67% in the Senate, 67 out of 100 votes, 2/3, that's very difficult. So, but the case that I was going to tell you about that's I think especially pertinent now that we were just talking about war powers is the War Powers Act. So Congress has the right to declare war, but with Vietnam, it was kind of this limbo. It was kind of this in between. It wasn't really clear. And as the American people started to get more frustrated with the U.S. involvement there militarily, Congress brought something to Richard Nixon's desk, which was called, and if you want to write this down, the War Powers Act. And here's what it is. It is a limitation placed on presidents that was already implied in the Constitution, but this is specific. It says that the president has only 60 days to take troops into some type of conflict or to engage in military conflict, and 30 days to withdraw and be done. So a total, it's probably a little easier to remember, and I'm fine with you stating it this way on the test. 90 days max. The president. So here's what that would look like I think in a manner we could all agree is appropriate or at least fairly objectively sensible. If Osama bin Laden, the guy who masterminded 9/11, the terrorist, if the United States is searching for him, and they finally, in this case, find him, he's fled to western Pakistan through eastern Afghanistan over the years, and President Obama's president at the time. He gets a call in the middle of the night, whatever time it was. They ask him, do we have yes or no? Do we have your permission to go ahead with the mission to take him out? It wouldn't make sense if Obama was like, well, I know you all have this person. You think you're going to get him. I probably think you're right. It probably is him. But I just want to get Congress's opinion on this. We probably need to vote. So look, I'm going to go ahead and convene Congress. I'm going to call 100 senators and 435 people in the House. I mean, we don't have time for that. That decision has to be made immediately. And so it was. And that I don't think most people would would say that's a violation of presidential powers. That probably more of an example of what it would be appropriately used for, and why you wouldn't always be able to call all of Congress or even need to. In that case, I don't think there was much debate about that. But imagine something like this, where the president wants to use nuclear bombs. There isn't really anything that limits the president in those 90 days in the wording legally that would necessarily limit them from using a nuclear weapon. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's it. The good news about nuclear weapons is something called MAD, and it's called mutually assured destruction. You might say, how is that good? Well, what it means is that the U.S. and every nuclear power knows that if they use nuclear weapons on another country, that if that country has nuclear weapons, they will also use them on us as a reply, as a revenge, as a response. So it's not rational to go kill millions of people if you're going to incur millions of casualties yourself. So, but it doesn't preclude the president. Preclude means to prevent or disallow. It doesn't mean the president couldn't do it. I don't think it will happen, but that's a very big question of that 90 days. What can be done? But then on the other hand, depending on how you see it, the Afghanistan war was a full 20 years long. So limiting a president to 90 days, had Bush not gotten the authority to go into Afghanistan, it would have been a 90-day conflict. And that's it. And instead, because Congress authorized it, it's 20 years long. So that's why that War Powers Act is important. Now, here's the rest of the story. Richard Nixon doesn't want to sign it. I give him a hard time. It's easy to. One of the more corrupt presidents, but at the same time, to be fair, I don't know any president, many, who would be like, okay, I'm going to sign something into law that limits my power. Most people won't do that. They maybe should, but they know that. So he didn't sign it, and so But what you're saying, Professor V, is that there's this War Powers Act that limits the president to 90 days total in conflict without asking Congress's getting their approval. But after that, they could be up for impeachment and conviction. So what's this whole? How did this happen? Because Nixon didn't sign it. Well, he didn't sign it, so it goes in the trash can basically, and then the Congress votes again, and they do obtain over 2/3 of the vote. So over top of Nixon's no was yes, and that became a law without the president's signature. That, to me, is one of my favorite examples of why it's important that Congress is allowed to and able to override vetoes. And it is such a high mark of 67, senators and 2/3 in the House. That doesn't happen very often. Way fewer than a half dozen times out of 100 bills, but they have that there if they need it. If the president is stubborn about something or wrong, the Congress can just go past them anyway. Next, for your notes, some of these other ones are fairly interesting and kind of maybe not as thought about today, but something like the Congress controlling the post office. So the Constitution sets up for a postal service, and it's kind of funny to think about how much things have changed. That at the time, that would have been like the source to get any news or any real information would be through the mail. Now, look at what we're doing. There's a million ways to transmit information. You don't even need the mail to pay your bills anymore or to do almost anything. So it's a little bit unfortunate for the post office in terms of just the business model. They're not. What are they supposed to do? If people want to pay their bills online, then half the mail that 20 years ago was going to paying bills online and circulating, and they were getting money from stamps and from companies sending bills and people sending the check back in. That's now no longer part of their revenue. So they have to be funded, obviously, by Congress generously to stay in business. You might say, well, why do they need to still stay in? Well, first, the Constitution, and the other reason that complements that answer is, what if it's something like jury duty? and this is the biggest one we've talked about a lot, voting by mail. Those two things in and of itself almost, but driver's licenses, passports, things like that. There needs to be that official source of government mail, and so that's what the Constitution set out. Another one that you may not have known are weights and measures. So, as you know, in the United States, people count usually by miles of an hour instead of kilometers an hour. So I did a marathon last year for the first time, and somebody at the race said something at the very beginning, like, "Are you ready to run however many kilometers?" And I'm like, "Wait, that's a really high number, 50 something." Someone have to do the math for me. I don't remember off the top of my head. But I'm thinking it's 26.2 miles, and then I hear this number, kilometers. Well, not everyone in the U.S. does that, but if you're used to that, that's normal because the standard has been set by Congress that's how things. So, like, for example, how does that affect me, Professor B? Well, how does the government affect that? Well, think about it. If you get a speeding ticket, they're going to judge it on how many miles per hour you're going, not kilometers an hour. Also, things like an inch instead of a centimeter, or a yard instead of a meter. So it's little outdated almost, because I don't think that. What I mean by that is I don't know that the Congress would change the metric system at this point, but they could, and it's something they control. And it's kind of like the post office. It's been this way for so long that's why a lot of people don't know that Congress really has the power over that, although they do. Congress also has the power to create courts as long as they're inferior to the Supreme Court. So that's another thing for your notes there. They can create courts as long as they're inferior. So in some cases, you could talk, it might be military courts, it could be immigration courts, there could be other federal courts underneath, regional. That's a pretty big power as well, of Congress. And because Congress funds everything in the federal government, it's very important, we'll learn this next lecture, that they don't bump up a Supreme Court justice's pay if they make a decision on a case that they agree with, or dock their pay if they decide on a case that is something unfavorable to Congress. It's steady pay, but they would fund that, and they would be able to create courts. Another thing for your notes here that Congress gets to do, they also have this ability to, and this is almost like a cuss word in politics, and it's called gerrymandering. I'm gonna share a video with you all about that so you could see what it's all about, like visually. But gerrymandering is the idea that, so remember in this one, if you're writing in your notes, it only applies to the House of Representatives. And the reason is because the House of Representatives is based on population, and districts are based, right, by where people live and how many people live where and when they move. The districts need to be redrawn. And just so it's the easiest explanation, every 10 years there's a census the government does, and they find out where everyone lives, how many people live where, and it's supposed to be that every 10 years after the census, there's just a splitting up of districts. They're going to look different sizes, they're going to look different shapes, but they should all contain the same number of people, roughly. So a bit less than 1 million people per district, and that's what it should capture. But gerrymandering is this. So if you want to write this in your notes, this is the best way I've heard it said. I don't think I came up with it, but I'm using it. And that is, the way that districting is supposed to work for congressional purposes is that the voters choose their representatives. So in other words, I live in a district, I get to vote for who I want to represent me. What gerrymandering does is it flips that. It makes it so that the representatives are choosing who their voters are. And if that doesn't make sense, imagine this. Imagine in one county in California, over the course of 10 years, and this happens all the time and all over the country in multiple different ways and places and demographic trends. Let's say over 10 years, a county in California has, say San Bernardino, has, I don't know, a half of its population moved west, and now they're in Los Angeles County. and then 10 years goes by and the map needs to be redrawn. But let's just say, for an example, and this is just an example, it's not based on any particular actual, but just to get the point across, if the voters that moved mostly were dominated by, say, mostly Republican voters, or if there was a way to be able to see, okay, this group of people that's been in this district have voted this way, and political scientists spend all kinds of time, sociologists as well, and politicians, learning where people live and how they vote. And part of it is, maybe to be cynical, well, they're just like researching who we are to use us and manipulate us and tell us what we want to hear. The other side of the coin on that, the other perspective is, well, they're supposed to care about who their constituents are and what their needs are, so they need to know the makeup of their district. So it probably depends on the person as to how they see that. But gerrymandering is saying, okay, if half the district that I had was moved away, and now the people that have moved into my district are more Democrat leaning voters, but I'm a Republican. And so half my constituency is now in a different district. And now I got all these other people coming from, I don't know, another part of California that are more Democrat. I don't want them in my district because I'm not going to win the election. So the lines would be redrawn in order to always capture the audience that's going to be most likely to listen and vote for you, and to exclude voters as much as you could that have moved into your district that won't vote for you. So it's basically manipulation of drawing of the voting lines, and it happens quite a bit. It's often difficult to catch. The Supreme Court has ruled that especially things like racial gerrymandering are illegal, and when it's blatant, districts will get shot down by the courts. But generally speaking, that is the one kind of dirty word that the Congress, and to be fair, not everywhere does that happen. So in California, for example, and other states that have been more proactive on this, there are commissions where they're independent people, not local, state or congressional representatives. They're not partisan. They're not running for an election per se. There's just experts or volunteers almost in some states even, but experts or volunteers that say, hey, here's the 850,000 people that are going to go in this district, draw the lines there. Okay, and then let's draw the next lines to capture the next group. It's kind of like having a class size of 40 people or 60 or 80 people. Wherever people move, you gotta have the same number of people in your class. So that's the idea with the districts. Gerrymandering is, in summary, it's supposed to be that voters choose the representatives, but gerrymandering is representatives choosing their voters. Who's in my district? Sweet. Now I'm going to get reelected. That's a disaster, but it does happen, and it's very hard to catch. One or two more things, but just as a reminder, again, all the branches, when we say checks and balances, have these ways to sort of look at the other branch and say, maybe we don't like the way things are going here. So one interesting thing that we talked about just briefly about the Supreme Court with this with Congress is that they do have the ability to ask questions of Supreme Court justices in those Senate hearings. Kamala Harris was sort of a famous viral moment now, where she asked a question of now Justice Kavanaugh about whether or not he knew of any laws that dictated about a man's body, like a male's body. That was her question. And her point was that there are laws about governing women's bodies, but not men's. And she was trying to make the dichotomy that was like talking about Roe versus Wade, not being changed. It's important to note that you can change a precedent like that, but if you do say somebody just basically lied in in a hearing like that. And I'll tell you why I say that, because there are two sides to this. Some people think that Justice Kavanaugh should be impeached and convicted by the Senate because they feel he lied to, say, Kamala Harris or other people that were in the Senate when they asked, and here was another question she and some other Democrats asked him, will you overturn Roe versus Wade? Basically, yes or no. And the answer was, like, they didn't say I will or won't flat out, but what they did say was, and Justice Kavanaugh basically said, I respect precedent, I respect the laws that have been around, the cases before. So he definitely made it seem like he wasn't going to touch it. That legally is not probably quite enough. I think if you disagree with his ruling on that in the Supreme Court's ruling, it makes sense that you would say that that was a very misleading answer. But the reason I tell this story is actually just to tell you about another word that you probably only hear in politics. It's a very specific word, and that's the word Bork or Borked. And Robert Bork was Bork. Was a justice that went in front of the Senate for confirmation during Ronald Reagan's tenure. And he was very open with senators, like questions like Kamala Harris was asking Justice Kavanaugh, the kind of questions like that, he was answering them very openly, honestly, and so much so that he revealed a lot of very conservative values. No one's judging here whether they're good or bad values, whether they're right or wrong, but the country, at least enough people, contacted their senators after hearing the things that Robert Bork stood for and that he wanted to do in terms of taking cases and changing the law, that constituents called their senators enough to say, hey, don't vote for this Supreme Court justice. You're my senator. I can't vote on them, so I'm asking you not to. Go for the next person, or I'm not going to maybe support you anymore. If my senator, does that make sense? So senators do feel, and they should to some degree. It's designed that way. Some pressure by the voters to make the right decision on whether or not to confirm the president's appointments or not. With that said, we'll wrap up there for today. I hope y'all learned a lot. I feel like we've done a ton on Congress, so take a deep breath. You all have conquered it. We'll be talking about the Supreme Court next, and can't wait to hear from everybody about what you think about U.S. Congress. Talk to you soon, everyone. Adios for now.